This video looks at three responses to the bebop of the 1940s, namely cool, Latin, and modal jazzes. Along the way, it introduces key jazz musicians of the second half of the 20th century, namely Miles Davis Jr., Dave Brubeck, and Stan Getz. It is meant to supplement your study of the listening guides on the course website. The 1950s and 60s were a time of great prosperity in the United States. Families were moving to spacious houses in the suburbs and buying cars and televisions. Teenagers had disposable income really for the first time and were using it to purchase recordings and support music. Technological advancement was seen as a priority, whether it concerned electric can openers or the race to make it to the moon before the Soviet Union. The Cold War also brought with it a certain conservatism and the impulse to protect oneself and one's family from what were perceived as distressing developments elsewhere in the world. The swing era was over, and as noted previously, bebop had never really taken root as popular music. By the mid-1950s, jazz would have growing competition from the new sounds of rock and roll. With the rise of Motown in the 1960s, even African Americans would stop listening to jazz. Partly as a response to audience disinterest in bebop, jazz musicians of the 50s slowed things down a bit, both literally and figuratively. Along with slower tempos, this so-called cool jazz featured the new timbres of the vibraphone, which you see pictured on your screen. Jazz composers instructed their brass players to use mutes for entire compositions, and drummers started using brushes in addition to drumsticks. In contrast with the complicated, hardly singable melodies of bebop, cool jazz features tunes that were easily heard in its sparse homophonic textures, most often played by small combos. Miles Davis's 1957 album, Birth of the Cool, gave a name to these new jazz sounds. Before talking about the album, we should say a little bit about Miles Davis himself. He was perhaps the most important jazz musician of the second half of the 20th century. Miles Davis III grew up in Illinois, the son of an affluent African-American dentist. He learned to play the trumpet and soon was a fine player. In 1944, he moved to New York City to study at the most famous music conservatory in the United States, the Juilliard School. More interested in jazz than classical music, he soon dropped out and established a reputation playing with bebop musicians such as Charlie Parker and Max Roach. A fine trumpet player, Davis still could not compete with the virtuosity of Gillespie, Eldridge, and others. So instead he focused on developing a complex trumpet timbre and a strong sense of lyricism. Over the course of his long career, Davis would change styles often, but his pursuit of lyricism and interesting timbres remained constant. The recordings of 1949 and 1950 that would be eventually released as Birth of the Cool in 1957 reflect these priorities. The Birth of the Cool performing forces was a non-net, or an ensemble of 9. The non-net consisted of standard jazz combo instruments such as trumpet, trombone, saxophones, piano, bass, drums, and vocalist, as well as less typical instruments such as the French horn and the tuba, which of course then provided different tone colors, different timbres. One of the most famous tunes on Birth of the Cool is Boplicity, a composition that despite its name is much more cool than bebop. It features a complex but tuneful melody that circles back on itself in a very slow tempo duple meter. Note the distinctive timbres from the drums played with brushes. The listening guide on the screen is more extensively discussed as part of the listening guide for jazz in the 1950s and 60s on your course website. Also important in the 1950s was what jazz musician and critic Gunther Schuller has called the third stream jazz. By this, Schuller meant jazz that blends tradition and innovation. The most prominent representations of third stream jazz were the music of the Modern Jazz Quartet, or the MJQ for short. Like Miles Davis's Cool, the Modern Jazz Quartet's third stream jazz often featured slower tempos, lyrical melodies, and soft and resonant new timbres. In fact, third stream jazz may be seen in some ways as a subset of the wider movement of cool jazz. For most of its existence, the Modern Jazz Quartet's personnel consisted of John Lewis on piano, Percy Heath on double bass, Kenny Clarke on drums, and Milt Jackson on vibes, that is vibraphone. Make sure you listen to the recording of Lewis's composition Django on your playlist. As appropriate for third string jazz, Django plays tribute to a famous jazz guitarist of the 1930s and 40s named Django Reinhardt. Reinhardt was a gypsy who grew up in Belgium and who, for most of his short life, played jazz in Parisian clubs with the French jazz violinist Stéphane Grappelli. Another important contributor to cool jazz and the third stream movement was Dave Brubeck. Born in California, Brubeck's musical career got a start during World War II, where he was ordered to start a band to entertain the troops. Back in the United States in 1951, he formed the Dave Brubeck Quartet with Joe Morello on drums, Paul Desmond on alto saxophone, and Eugene Wright on bass. Their style of jazz was particularly appealing to college students of the 1960s who had outgrown the more teenage-focused rock and roll. The Brubeck Quartet's 1959 album Time Out features a number of hits, the most famous of which is Take 5, which we of course have already encountered in our study of rhythm. Make sure to listen to it again on your playlist and review the listening guide that introduces this composition. Of course, you can also see photos of the quartet on your screen. Brubeck was their pianist. Also increasingly popular in the 1950s was Latin jazz. Jazz had seen Afro-Caribbean influences since the 1930s. You've already listened to Rita Rio's band in the playlist devoted to women in jazz, and you can check out her recording of a tune called My Margarita as well. Many of you also perhaps have seen the famous TV sitcom of the 1950s that followed the musical career of I Love Lucy's wife, Ricky Ricardo, who was played by the real-life band leader and Lucille Ball's husband, Desi Arnaz. The most important jazz musician of the 1950s to incorporate Latin styles into jazz was Stan Getz. Starting as a saxophone player, Getz quickly transitioned into the role of bandleader. As such, he brought Brazilian bossa nova, which had recently developed from samba music, to the United States. Getz's classic Latin number from the 1960s is The Girl from Ipanema. This song was written by Antonio Carlos Jobim, and it was sung by Astrud Gilberto, who was at that time Jobim's wife. It merges the standard bossa nova rhythmic ostinato with the slow tempos, sparse homophonic textures, and spacey timbres of cool jazz. Make sure to study this number in your listening guide. Although third stream jazz could be relatively complex, much of the impulse behind the cool was simplification. After having simplified his jazz style, Miles Davis looked for ways to continue to innovate and hit upon modal jazz. Modal jazz organizes itself around modes, which are simply another name for scales. This is different than jazz up to this time, which had focused mostly on harmonic changes. Just think about how much we have said about the harmonic progressions, such as the 12-bar blues or the rhythm changes, as a basis for many bebop compositions. On the album Kind of Blue from 1959, the Miles Davis Sextet used a large number of scales or modes. The sextet of John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley on saxophone, Bill Evans on piano, Jimmy Cobb on drums, and Paul Chambers on double bass took a novel approach to their improvisations and collaborations. The result is an album that is not rarely pointed to as the best jazz album ever produced. On this note, we end our video about cool Latin and modal jazzes.